Every time there's an economic dip in society, people try to put women back in the kitchen. I'm a woman, so it makes sense that I fight for the justice for other women. But I want men to have justice too. I've put my energy for quite a long time into trying to inquire why we think it's okay for 50% of the world to not be equal. But it doesn't mean that I don't care about all of the others.
Jude Kelly, welcome to Ways to Change the World.
Thank you.
How would you change the world?
I would change the way that we viewed education at every level of society. So I would start with the idea that we could solve an awful lot of problems if we did prevention rather than action after the problem. And I would start with family education, because I believe that the family is still the driving force for change in a child's life. And I would start with the idea that, the justice within a family structure, how a man and a woman are equal, or if it's same sex, how the partners are equal, how the children are equal, and how they benefit from the idea that the children need to learn different kinds of social skills than maybe their parents learned, different kinds of ways of conducting healthy relationships. So I would pour a lot more effort into that nuclear family as a start in terms of education. Then I would spread out from that into society generally to educate on everything from health, violence, money, all the things that humans need to lead a sane, intelligent and humorous life. I would imply, or do, an education at grassroots level all across the board. Because I think at the moment what we're doing is we retrospectively educate people. After violence has happened, we say, well, that was probably a bad thing, wasn't it? After people have had health crisis, we say, well, you shouldn't have done this. We don't really begin at the very start with how would you lead a healthy, intelligent, positive life in a community setting. So education, I believe, informal education is the key to so much change.
Do you think we have the shared values, though, of what equity means between the sexes and what a family should be?
I don't think we have those shared values yet. If you say to a family, would you like to have an unjust family? Would you like to have a tyrannical family? Would you like to have a violent family? Would you like to have a chaotic or dysfunctional family? Most people will say, of course not. Whether they have the tools to avoid that, of course, is another matter. But I think we share values in the sense of what we wouldn't like to be, with some exceptions. And if you can start from that, well, if we wouldn't like to be like this, what would we like to be and how will we be like that? I think you've got the starting point for education.
What does equality mean to you? How would you describe it as it should be?
Well, I think that equality is that every single person's potential isn't trapped inside any sort of cultural norm or social structure that's told them already that they're pegged below or beneath in any way. So the potential to fully realize yourself should be a human right. I think that equality means examining and then dissolving the things at the moment that are set in scriptural stone and set in fiscal and legal stone, which are at the moment that men must be in charge of society and of theology, and that women must assist in helping men run the world well. I think that's how society has ordered itself for thousands of years. And I would say that's unjust. And also it takes away the potential of the human race to be even more amazing. And it seems to me outlandish and sort of ignorant to carry on in that mode. And if you think that begins with two children, one happens to be a boy, one happens to be a girl, and they've already been fated to have entitlement or less entitlement, depending. That, I think, is just a crazy way to carry on.
Did you feel that yourself?
Well, I'm one of 4 daughters of a father who had 8 sisters. And having watched his 8 sisters not be given the rights that his brothers were, he actually felt that very keenly. Maybe because he was the youngest, maybe because he went and fought in the war, he came back with a strong sense of social justice. And he and my mum very much felt as if the 4 daughters should be able to do whatever we want and make our dreams come true. We were the first generation to go to university. This is a very sort of typical upwardly mobile immigrant story from an Irish background. And so I didn't feel in my family that injustice, but I immediately felt it at school. I immediately was told what I couldn't do. I couldn't play football for a start. I couldn't be a cowboy. And then a bit later on, I was literally told by a physics teacher that girls' brains are smaller than boys. And so it went on. And it was only because, I suppose, perhaps growing up in Liverpool and watching the Grand National every year and watching those horses just go, I'm going to go over that hedge. I had a kind of stamina that made me think I'm going to buck this trend. But not everybody could or did, and that makes me very sad.
So were you brought up as feminists?
Never used
or was
that word.
Not a word?
Never, there wasn't a
childhood?
word.
Yeah.
Not at all, no. And my mother was, a sort of stay-at-home mum for a long time, making the house wonderful for us as little girls. No, I wasn't brought up as a feminist. I was brought up as a human who had the right to be as good as another human. That was really the philosophy we worked on. And at the same time, very much instructed by my granddad in particular to be respectful of everybody else, because in the centre of Liverpool where we first started off, we were the third in. He used to remind us, don't forget you're the third in. The first in were the Chinese, the second in were the West African sailors, and the third in were the Irish. And he said, respect who went before and make that part of your mantra. So we did. It wasn't until we moved to another district, because my father took exams and we started being upwardly mobile, that I realized that if you were white, which I am, you could enter spaces that my friends then didn't enter as easily. And that's, I suppose, when I got a flavor of social justice or injustice. And I think before I was a feminist, I was somebody who was alert to the consequences of injustice for everybody. And I still feel that, I'm a woman, so it makes sense that I fight for the justice for other women. But I'm also a mother of a son and the grandmother of a grandson. And I want men to have justice too. And I see plenty of white working class boys who are completely forgotten. I see plenty of black boys being stopped over and over again for crimes that they wouldn't have even dreamt of committing. And, they need justice too. So I've put my energy for quite a long time into trying to inquire why we think it's okay for 50% of the world to not be equal. But it doesn't mean that I don't care about all of the others. And I hope people are fighting just as valiantly for them.
And what have you concluded as to why?
Well, I think that scripture and theology have really, really cemented into people's heads the idea that the divine is male. And we have no evidence, and I just don't believe it. I think anything as magnificent as a creator of a universe couldn't possibly have a gender as simplistic as it's a bloke. But it has suited the politics of the societies to say that is where that is the case. And I think once you peg the idea of divinity to masculinity, then you make it virtually impossible for people to pull away to say, well, I'm defying that edict, because how does that look respectful in societies that are religious? So that's, I think, a major, major issue. And of course, from that came so many laws and customs. But then even in societies that are then secular, I think that we have a feeling about that the sort of things that go with masculinity. We needed at one time for those things to be go-tos for war, go-tos for being on the battlefield. And we needed women not just to be at home looking after the babies, let's be honest, women to be at home running the farms, running the businesses, taking over the arms factories. I mean, we needed women, if you like, to be the people who ran the society when men were away, which they were for year upon year often. But I think we've cemented those ideas as well into the notion that strength, physical strength, is more important, which it clearly isn't anymore.
I mean, we're back in a sort of a macho, militaristic, to some degree, world at the moment. Do you, if you look at the family photo of world leaders meeting,
3 women, yeah,
in London, a couple of women, but it's all men. The language is the language of aggression. Have we gone backwards?
I think we're in a really difficult loop at this particular moment, yes. And it's been coming at it for a while, hasn't it? Because when you have this phrase strong men, which has been coming for a while, Xi, Putin, Erdogan, Trump, obviously, and Bolsonaro, and obviously wall-to-wall films reinforcing that, and video games and so on. I think every so often people go, should we just let them do it and see what happens? Because as long as I can, be on my iPhone and do my YouTube, whatever. But I think the world rights itself again when it goes to those places of maximum brutality. And I'm not suggesting that's where we're heading, but I'm saying, that language, the world actually reels back in horror and often resets. And it often resets saying, let's have even better values than we had, or let's remember the values. So although I'm finding this period dismaying, it doesn't make me feel as if that's the end of everything I believe in.
I mean, we're actually seeing it even more acutely than that in America in some ways. There's very much a resurgence of the traditional woman. We're seeing women who are almost deliberately chosen for their look, and who are owning it. If you look at the new sort of Washington, the White House, core, there's a couple of new women in there from new media,
yes,
who are saying, well, no, women should be pretty and, wear mini skirts and do all of that kind of thing. And that's part of being a woman. I mean, do you throw your hands up in horror, or do you go, well, they're owning their moment?
Look, I think that women are as capable as being idiots as men. That's the first thing. And I think that women are as capable and are as entitled as men to say, I fancy this identity, I want to do this. The difficulty is that when women own identities that have equaled in society symbolism for a bit stupid or a bit available or anything that denigrates women, then they're owning something which has poor value. Now, that's their choice, but they need to know what they're playing with, as it were, when they walk into those stereotypes. If the stereotypes were equal in terms of what then society gave back in return, then maybe it wouldn't be so tricky, but they're not equal. But going back to the point about, do I throw my hands up in horror? One of the reasons I started WOW, which was 15 years ago now, was because actually I was meeting so many women in the global south who were saying, we didn't need feminism anymore. I mean, look, we've got education, we've got jobs. And it was a ladette culture. We can drink as much beer as guys, we can have as much sex as guys, et cetera, et cetera. When you scratch under the surface of that and you said, well, yes, like once you had your child, how did that feel? They said, well, actually, I do all the work and I go to work as well, and this and that. And then, violence against women in the house as well as violence against women in the world, et cetera. And you realize that there was a sort of very understandable desire for women to think we had equality, because it's humiliating not to have it. You don't want to be a victim. You want to feel that you've got great agency and that I can look at you and go, I'm your equal. But we're not. We're not in society. We are not equal. So I understand why women just go, can I leave all that rubbish behind, please, and just have my life? Of course, it's exhausting to be fighting for human rights. And on a daily basis, often people make you feel as if you are a romantic or you're ridiculous or you're just boring. But when I also then see that, yes, young girls finally were able to play football, having been banned since the 1930s, and they can win the World Cup. When I see women getting, Nobel Prizes for this, that, and the other, you think, why would the world want that to stop? So it's interesting that Trump is trying to put the brakes on something. Every time there's an economic dip in society, people try to put women back in the kitchen. And the reason they do that is because they're scared about male unemployment. Males are brought up to feel that without work, what is their purpose? And so when, you can see that when men were demobbed from the Second World War, like Dad, it took 2 years to demob them. It was essential that the women came away from running ambulance services, didn't run the fire brigade anymore, didn't work in the arms factories, went back into the kitchen. So women get sold an idea that actually, wouldn't you rather be in the kitchen? Isn't that better? Isn't that lovelier? Isn't that more natural? And, we believe it because advertising is very good. And also we don't want men to be unhappy. And that's a big deal. Women love men and they don't want men to be unhappy. So when there's an economic downturn and the world looks frightened, men get frightened and women try to look after them. And one way to do it is by making everything sort of normal like it used to be. But I don't think it's not a safe space to stay in because it won't last.
If you think about your own career, how much time did you spend in the theatre trying to convey these sorts of ideas? And did you leave because you needed to be more direct about it?
Yes, well, I directed all kinds of things in the theatre, operas, musicals, straight plays, Chekhov, Shakespeare, new plays. And not every single piece of work I did was in any way a sort of, call to arms to change the world. Not at all. I mean, I love work that just tells us how weird and amazing we are, and I think that I stopped doing theatre sort of centrally for the time that I've done that because I was frustrated with feeling that no matter how great Arthur Miller is, no matter how great Chekhov is, no matter how great Ibsen is, they're all telling the same story over and over again, which are almost always that men are central to the problem, and that men are that women can be the victims, but they can't be the solution. So it was very, very rare to have women as protagonists. But more than that, in my life, I've had a miscarriage. I've had a child who's died from a cot death. I never saw those in theatre. I mean, I've been through menopause, never saw that in theatre. Obviously, periods, never heard that in theatre. Just the very ordinary, basic facts of being a woman and having a woman's life, never saw that in theatre. We hardly ever saw plays about domestic violence. We hardly ever saw women who were being entrepreneurs and business women. We didn't even have women doctors. I mean, you do have these things now.
Why?
More. Because... who
are the great women playwrights? And why haven't you seen these stories?
Well, because there were so few women playwrights. I mean, obviously, education has always been a contested space for women. If you just switch it over from theatre for a minute to visual arts, women weren't even allowed to study the anatomy, and until very recently, they weren't allowed to go to art school. They weren't allowed to do drama, for years and years because it was thought to be an unclean profession, etc., etc. And women as directors, which I wanted to be from when I was about 12, but there were so few of them. And the ones that were in existence, somehow history buried their story, so you didn't even know that they existed. Again, it's the idea that women were not suited for leadership. Women weren't suited to be intellectual beings. Women, weren't suited to, if you like, discover on behalf of humanity what humanity needed to learn. And so we moved into this place, I suppose, in the 70s, where you'd say, well, there are women's stories. Interestingly, women read women's novelists, men don't read women novelists. I was brought up reading men's novels and learning about men and watching men on television and watching men in theatre and film. Men don't do that. So as a result, they have this sort of educational deficit about what women's lives are like. And I just saw that...
just on that, is there a little bit of culpability, though, within the women's fiction industry as well, which often projects itself as for women?
Well, culpability. I think it's been true that, if you like, here is something that you've waited for years for, women, and here it is. So there's been a kind of huge hunger that's been revealed, and here's the food that you need. And I think it's interesting that when you say on the back of a cover, a man's journey, he was a lost soul. Why was he so broken? A woman will pick up that and read it.
And a man won't.
And if it says a woman's journey, she's broken, but a man won't do that. Now, so let me reverse the question and ask you, if I'm allowed to, why doesn't a man want to find out what that woman's journey is like? Does he think it's not relevant to him? Does he think somehow it will weaken him to be seen reading it or spend time reading it? Like, what is it that makes men feel they don't need to know anything about that? I don't fully understand.
I mean, isn't the cliched answer that men are self-centered and lack empathy and aren't that curious in a way that women are?
Well, if they are all those things, then they shouldn't be running the world, should they? But I don't believe that they are not without curiosity and not without empathy and totally self-centered.
So they're curious about other men.
Yes, they are curious about other men. So men do love men. I mean, not always erotically, obviously, but in some ways they are very, very interested in men, but not very interested in women. And I think that that's a real problem, which often gets solved by men when they have daughters. I mean, whatever we might think about, it's a bit of a late awakening. Nevertheless, better than not. But I don't think
that's always the man's answer.
It is
when
always
challenged. Well, I have daughters.
Yes, exactly. But I don't believe that it is sort of in men's DNA to not have empathy or not be curious about women. I don't think that's
the way
true.
we're brought up.
I think it's the way we're brought up. I think it's the way we're socialised. But socialised over hundreds of years. We are doing so many experiments, aren't we, on poor old mice? And I saw an experiment recently on this group of mice who were, one generation was given a shock when they smelt coffee. And the next generation of mice inherited the fear of the coffee, even though they weren't given the shock. And that shock fear with coffee lasted for 4 generations of mice. So that tells you something about something which becomes a sort of a cultural norm. I'm not just talking about a trauma, but something which is embedded. I think it's inherited. I don't think it's just, however people say, well, I tried to give my child a doll and he wanted a sword. That proves that, boys are boys and girls are girls. I don't think it is that simple. I also think, though, that biology is complicated too.
But you rose, to the top of the arts establishment.
Mm-hmm.
I think I first interviewed you around 1997.
Oh, yeah.
Beginning of sort of Cool Britannia.
Right.
Do you think that whole period sort of failed to lock in the values of progress that they were trying? That time felt to me as though there was real change going on.
Yes, I think there was real change,
and there was an excitement around that change, and then I don't know what happened.
I don't think that. I don't have as bleak a kind of picture as that. I think that we have carried on making very substantial change. So if I just talk about language for a minute, women's bodies and women's health. Unless you're in Afghanistan or Iran, you are allowed to discuss all the things that women have as bodily functions and bodily problems. And as a result, the research is getting better. That hasn't slowed down, actually, that's accelerated. I think that we now talk openly about violence against women and men. We don't know how to solve it, but we're not frightened to talk about it anymore. So I think there's progress that has happened both culturally and in terms of economics and research, which isn't going to go away just because of this recent wave.
But that recent wave is powerful, though, isn't it? Does this pushback? This whole conversation would be dismissed by many as woke rubbish.
Absolutely. And don't get me wrong, it's not that I'm not scared. I am distressed by what's happening. But does it make me feel, it's all over now? I don't feel that, no. I think that one of the things that we need to be very aware of with kind of, obviously I think it's terribly sad that a word woke, which actually, as I understand it, was created by the Black community to sort of go, do we understand the world as it really is? Are we awake to the world as it really is? I think it's a real shame that it's been sort of co-opted as something so negative to throw back at people as a rebuke. But yes, listening to this conversation, some people would always have thought that what I was saying was nonsense. But a lot of people won't think that. They won't know how to solve the world, and neither do I. But they won't necessarily think it's stupid. But I think because people don't know how to solve it quickly in their own lifetime, they think, well, maybe it's not meant to be. Whereas I think people who, want to think about human rights over the world as a whole, you have to think way beyond your own generation. You have to accept the fact that it's not in your own lifetime. But, I didn't get the vote, but I'm a recipient of it. I didn't organise birth control. I'm a recipient of it. I'm glad that people went before and did things that were incredibly hard in societies that didn't want it to happen. So if at the moment we're in a society, and let's not catastrophize the whole of the world around Trump and Vance. Let's say that actually they are pushing hard and other people may indeed kind of go, well, no, not in my backyard, actually. But I think that some of the things that we have won and proved we can do, you can't disprove that women can become the top of the tree in science. You can't disprove that they can be brilliant athletes. You can't disprove a lot of these things. Unless the world disappears, under an avalanche as a whole, women can demonstrate they have done these things.
And has your belief that, education is the way to do this, come from the festivals. What have you learned from running these festivals about how you make people think?
Yeah, I mean, what I've learned is that informal education, through people talking to other people, through people telling stories that other people hadn't heard before, often people who, not celebrities, ordinary people telling their stories, empathy, this is what changes people's hearts and minds. Having a sense of sort of fearlessness, that you're allowed to talk about stuff and actually you're allowed to be ignorant, taking away all highfalutin language, saying, you don't have to have proper words, or you don't have to, you can make mistakes, it's fine, don't worry about it. Spontaneous education in generous circumstances and surroundings, that's what people learn from. And so I really, really believe in informal education through society and community actions. But I think you've got to be very, very inclusive. And by inclusive, I don't mean just along the sort of the groups of, I'm not just saying we have to be ethnically inclusive and sexually inclusive. I'm also saying that people who would never call themselves a feminist or aren't fighting for Black Lives Matter, let them all come in. Don't turn into a woke club. I'll use that word onto myself now. Please let's not turn the world into a group of people who are standing on a pedestal saying we know what's right, and another group of people who are telling, well, you're wrong. Because that is not caring, and it's not loving, and it's not likely to have a good outcome. So I do think part of the issue that we should face is that we maybe haven't been talking enough to the greater number of people on terms that would have been more careful in terms of the lives that they were experiencing.
Do the arts reach enough people, though? I mean, is it still too elitist or scary or...
Well, you've got a number of things here, haven't you? First of all, along with believing that I think all humans want to love, I think all humans are creative. It doesn't mean they all want to turn themselves into painters and dancers, but they are naturally creative in the playground, and we see that. And children love to make art, and they love to make stories, and they love to sing, and they love to dance. And so you'll never get rid of that. That is inside what being a human is. When you then grow it up through society, in its best form, it carries on being very natural. You carry on like being part of a play, being part of a singing group, etc., etc. That is the arts. When you professionalize it through virtuosity, and then you sort of like give it back to people and say, but you'll have to pay a lot for it now because it's sort of special. You've got to be very, very careful into not have a situation where you say, and actually, this is so good, you won't even appreciate it, and you won't even really like it, and anyway, you can't afford it, so don't bother. That's where I think the schism comes, and it's sad, and it's historically started with court society that said not only can you not watch it, but you're not allowed to read either, so you won't be able to understand it. And that idea, some humans love separating out into the special and the non-special. And some of other of us humans, like me, go, can't we all be back together again, please? It would be much better. Now, I think the arts want to be on the side of let's all get together. But I think the specialisms in the arts have always been used by, the rich and the wealthy to, if you like, be their own ornaments. How you put those back together again? I mean, that's why I think artists have got to be very, very profoundly committed to the societies in which they live, and not only, if you like, be at the beck and call of patrons. And that's why I think something like the funding that society gives the arts in this country is so good, because we really have tried to say there should be a theatre in every town, there should be an arts centre in every town, there should be dance halls in every town. We haven't succeeded in every town, but at least we are still trying to do that.
And so to come back to the festivals, again, in terms of sort of what's different about them.
Yeah.
And what they achieve.
Okay, well, let's just talk about festival form, which I really believe in. So if you go to see a theatre show or an art gallery, you're told to go into that space, you've got that time slot, you have to feel things between 7:30 and 9:30 because that's when it's happening. And in a way, you've got to sort of sit down and admire it. And, I love it, all of that as well, too. But you're trapped and you're spoken to, and that's the thing. In a festival, you say the word festival, nobody's frightened of the word festival in the way they're frightened of the word art. Everybody's been to a festival. They expect to be drinking something, eating something. They might fall in love with somebody or have a bit of a romance. They expect to bump into stuff, and they expect to have some surprise. And time is limitless, and it's up to them. They can go and come away and come back again, or they can stay for 24 hours. And that gives the human going to the festival a sense of their own adventure. You're on your own adventure, not told what to do. That, I think, automatically makes people much more open and curious and receptive. And when I've done WOW festivals, and let's face it, I've done, in so many parts of the world, like you're in Rio with 92,000 people. That's unbelievable over like 6 days. Or you're in some of the tiniest villages in the outback of Australia with Indigenous women teaching white settler women about healthcare. Again, absolutely amazing. But the point is that all of these people are sort of self-determining what they want to go to. So we put on, it's a bit like Glastonbury. Not everybody watching this podcast will have been to Glastonbury, but many, many stages. You think you're going to go and watch the main stage to see somebody, but actually you didn't quite get there because you stopped off at another stage. You saw they look interesting. Let's watch them instead. And that's what festivals do. They give you a serendipity, a sort of unexpected set of choices that you didn't even know were there. And that's education. That's real education. What you didn't know was there and nobody told you, and all of a sudden you find it. That's when a child or an adult goes, I think this could be mine. I understand this for me. So I've seen the most amazing transformations happen to people because they heard a story, they got involved in discussion, they met somebody in the queue, they watched something, and you can see their whole mindset shifts. And they think, maybe I could be more curious now about myself as well.
You started a festival for men.
I did, Being a Man.
Which ran for a few years.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm starting it again.
You are? I was going to say, did it fail or what happened to it?
No, it was great. I remember when I started it, everybody said to me, oh, men won't come. They won't want to do that. And then they said, well, if they do come, they'll only be sort of a particular type of men. They'll only be the very trendy sort of porridge eating, that kind of territory. And it wasn't true. We had many men. There wasn't anything like as big as WOW. I mean, the first WOW I did, I think 5,000 people came. I think for the Being a Man festival, the first one, about maybe 900 men came. But, that's not nothing for an arts event. And they were many different ages, many different backgrounds. And the same sort of thing with WOW, we put on lots. I didn't, program it all by myself. Don't get me wrong. I worked with men to make the program happen. But I did have the determination to say, look, I know I'm not a man, but based on the fact that I love men and I think men have a right to a space and a place to talk, how could we find a way of making an invitation good for men? It wasn't about a Trojan horse into feminism. It was like, men have got things they want to discuss. It was very successful. We did 3. And then I left Southbank Centre because WOW was growing so big, I couldn't do Southbank Centre and WOW. And I'd done 12 years at Southbank Centre. I thought, okay, let's take WOW to its next stage, to more countries around the world. And at that time, I just thought, I don't think I have myself got the bandwidth to kind of keep BAM going as well. So I sort of put it on ice for a bit. But this is hot off the press. In fact, this might be the first public news. I'm working with a group called Equimundo, who specifically work on men's wellness and healthy masculinity around the world. And they've come to work in partnership with us to create now some men's festivals. And we're looking at doing the first one in Brazil and then next one in London.
But your original answer to my first question suggested, actually, you need government buy-in for this kind of thing, don't you? This is not something that people can do by themselves. Because education is about schools.
Yeah.
They're writing a national curriculum now, again. Practically, how would you deliver it?
You mean rewriting the curriculum? I think that each of the subjects that you teach, whether it be maths or geography, all of them have value systems around them. All of them have histories of how we got here to teach this maths. So I think with more imagination around each of the core subject matters, you can teach values, history, and progress to children as young as 3. I deeply believed in Sure Start, and I think that reinventing Sure Start is incredibly important as well, because I think under fives is when so much happens. But yes, I would have government intervention at all our formal levels, including everything to do with health, everything to do with law. I would have government interventions to have a value-driven society. But I would also ask so much more of all of us, because there was a time when, people felt as if committing to their community was a key part of being in that community. And I think that we lost an awful lot of that because life is so quick and fast and busy and hectic, and we've sort of not connected up so much with groups of people who would say, well, who's volunteering for this and who's running this and who's that. We have to get back to a society that takes a lot more care on this informal education side, whether it be five-a-side football for kids or whatever it is. We need so much more of that. And when people say, well, there's no youth clubs these days, are there? I think, what's stopping you starting one? Don't wait. If I had waited all the time to be given permission to create the things I've done, well, nobody would have given me permission. So I do want, we cannot keep pushing everything back onto government to solve everything. We can't have it both ways. If we want to be brilliant people full of potential, then show it, and let's do it.
I think that's a good place to end. Jude Kelly, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us.